Mediterranean were given food, real food, full portions placed directly in front of them. But instead of reaching forward, the entire group stayed still, holding their position as if touching it first would trigger something they could not predict. And for several seconds, no one moved. The prisoners were directed toward the tables and stopped in front of the trays, each man aligning himself with a place without being told where to stand, while the food remained untouched in front of them. One prisoner near the front leaned slightly forward, lowering his gaze toward the tray, then straightened again without reaching out. Another man adjusted his position closer to the table, placing his hands at his sides before shifting them behind his back as he remained still. A third prisoner stepped half a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the food, then stopped immediately after, holding his position. One man at the center turned his head briefly toward the others, scanning their reactions before facing forward again. Another prisoner extended his hand halfway toward the tray, paused for a brief moment, then pulled it back without making contact. A man near the back stepped slightly to the side to see better, angling his body toward the table before returning to a straight stance. One prisoner shifted his weight from one foot to the other, adjusting his balance while keeping his gaze fixed on the food. Another man leaned forward again, lowering his head closer to the tray, then straightened without touching anything. A third prisoner moved his hand toward a utensil, stopped just before reaching it, then lowered his arm back to his side. One man near the front took a small step forward, then stopped, holding his position as the space around him remained still. Another prisoner turned his head toward a guard for a brief second, then returned his gaze to the tray when no reaction followed. The room remained silent, filled only with small adjustments in position as each man hesitated in front of the same moment. And as the trays remained untouched despite being within reach, the first shift took place because the refusal was not spoken, but visible in every movement that stopped just before action. One prisoner near the front moved first, stepping closer to the table and placing his hand on the edge, then sliding it forward until his fingers reached the bread. He lifted the piece slowly, holding it between his fingers without raising it immediately, keeping it just above the tray while maintaining his position. Another man beside him leaned forward slightly, adjusting his stance to gain a clearer view, then stopped as the movement paused again. The first prisoner turned the bread in his hand, rotating it slightly while pressing it between his fingers, then raised it halfway before stopping again. A third prisoner stepped closer, closing the distance by one step, then held his position while keeping his eyes fixed on the movement. The man holding the bread brought it closer to his face, pausing for a brief second, then lowered it slightly without taking a bite. Another prisoner shifted his weight and stepped to the side, repositioning himself to see around the men in front of him before becoming still again. The first prisoner raised the bread once more, this time higher, then stopped again just before taking a bite, holding the position for a longer moment. A man at the center reached forward and touched the edge of his tray, then pulled his hand back immediately without picking anything up. The first prisoner finally took a small bite, slow and controlled, then lowered his hand halfway while chewing without changing his posture. The room remained still, with several men adjusting their stance but not committing to movement. The prisoner swallowed, then raised the bread again and took a second bite, this time without pausing, continuing the action more naturally. A man near the front stepped closer to his own tray, lowering his head toward it, then stopping again before touching anything. Another prisoner lifted a utensil, held it briefly, then repositioned it on the tray and adjusted his stance. A third man leaned forward and picked up a small piece of food, then held it in his hand without eating, watching the man with the bread. One prisoner moved his tray slightly closer, pulling it toward him by a few inches, then stopped without continuing. Another man stepped forward and placed his hand on the table, holding that position while looking down. The movement began to spread slowly, not all at once, but through small actions that followed the first bite. And as the second bite was repeated without consequence and no reaction came from the guards, the second shift took place because the action that had been avoided was now happening in front of everyone, and the hesitation began to weaken. As the second bite was taken without interruption, several prisoners began to move at the same time, each one reacting in a slightly different way as the stillness finally started to break. One prisoner near the center stepped forward and picked up his utensil, holding it briefly before lowering it into the tray and taking a first small portion. Another man shifted closer to the table, placing both hands on the edge, then leaning forward and taking a quick piece before pulling back slightly. A third prisoner lifted his tray slightly, adjusting its position toward him, then set it down again and reached forward to take a piece of bread. One man at the front leaned forward without hesitation, taking a larger bite than the others, then continuing without pausing as he chewed. Another prisoner who had been standing still stepped forward and sat down quickly, pulling the tray closer as he began eating immediately. A man near the back moved around another prisoner, stepping into an open space, then reaching forward and taking food with a faster motion than before. One prisoner lifted a cup for the first time, bringing it to his mouth, taking a short drink, then placing it back down carefully. Another man shifted his body to face the table more directly, then leaned forward and took a bite without looking at the others. A third prisoner reached forward with both hands, adjusting his tray again, then began eating with a steady rhythm. One man who had been watching earlier finally moved, taking a quick step forward and picking up food without hesitation. Another prisoner leaned further over the table, continuing to eat without stopping, his movements now more direct than before. A man at the center adjusted his seat position, pulling himself closer to the table, then continued eating without pause. One prisoner moved his tray again, aligning it directly in front of him before continuing to take consecutive bites. Another man finished what he was holding, then immediately reached for more without hesitation, continuing the motion in a steady rhythm. The room filled with movement, no longer controlled by hesitation, but driven by repeated actions spreading from one side to the other. And as more prisoners began to eat without pausing or looking around, the third shift took place because the hesitation had fully broken and the action that started with one man had now spread across the entire room. As the movement across the tables intensified, several prisoners began to shift their attention toward the guards positioned along the edges of the room, expecting some form of reaction to the change in behavior. One prisoner near the center lifted his head while chewing, turning his gaze toward a guard standing near the entrance, then lowered it again when the guard did not move. Another man slowed his movement for a moment, holding a piece of food in his hand as he looked toward the side of the room, then continued eating when nothing changed. A third prisoner leaned back slightly in his seat, turning his head to the right to observe a guard, then leaned forward again and resumed eating without pause. One man at the front took a step away from the table while holding his food, then stopped and returned to his position when no instruction followed. Another prisoner stood halfway from his seat, adjusting his posture, then sat back down and continued eating as the guards remained still. A man near the back walked a few steps along the table while holding his tray, then stopped at a new position and began eating again. One prisoner lifted his cup and drank slowly while looking toward a guard, then placed it down and resumed eating without hesitation. Another man moved closer to the edge of the room, stepping past other prisoners, then stopped and turned back toward the table when nothing changed. A third prisoner adjusted his stance near a guard, standing closer than before, then stepped back and returned to his place at the table. One man shifted his tray again, pulling it toward him, then continued eating while occasionally glancing toward the guards. Another prisoner stood completely, taking a step forward with food in his hand, then stopped and remained in place before returning to his seat. The guards did not intervene, did not step forward, and did not interrupt the movement that had taken over the room. And as the prisoners continued to eat, stand, move, and adjust their positions without being corrected, the fourth shift took place because the absence of reaction confirmed that the action could continue without consequence. As the meal continued, the pace inside the room became faster and more consistent, with fewer pauses between movements and more direct actions at every table. One prisoner at the front reached forward without slowing, taking another portion and bringing it immediately toward his mouth without looking around. Another man pulled his tray closer with both hands, then leaned forward and continued eating with a steady rhythm that did not break. A third prisoner shifted his position along the bench, sliding slightly to create more space, then resumed eating without interruption. One man who had been standing earlier sat down fully, adjusting his seat quickly before continuing to eat without hesitation. Another prisoner lifted his cup, drank briefly, then placed it down and immediately reached for more food without pausing. A man near the center leaned forward further than before, resting part of his weight on the table as he continued to eat in repeated motions. One prisoner reached across his tray, taking food from a different section, then continued without stopping or looking at the others. Another man adjusted his grip on his utensil, then used it continuously without setting it down again. A third prisoner finished one portion and immediately reached for another, continuing the sequence of actions without delay. One man stood briefly to reposition himself, took a step to the side, then sat down again and resumed eating in the same rhythm. Another prisoner moved along the table to a new spot, carrying his tray, then stopped and continued eating without pause. A man near the back leaned forward quickly, took a bite, then followed with another without lifting his head. One prisoner shifted his tray again, aligning it directly in front of him before continuing with faster movements than before. Another man who had hesitated earlier now reached forward immediately, taking food without any visible pause between actions. The room no longer held any trace of the earlier stillness, replaced by continuous movement across every table as each prisoner repeated the same pattern of action. And as the final hesitation disappeared completely and the pace became steady across the entire room, the fifth shift took place because the action that had begun slowly was now fully established and no longer questioned. As the movement across the tables continued for a moment longer, the pace began to slow gradually, not from hesitation, but as trays became lighter and actions reached their end. One prisoner near the front lowered his hand after finishing what he was holding, paused briefly, then reached forward again to collect what remained on his tray. Another man leaned back slightly in his seat, lifting his shoulders away from the table, then leaned forward again and took a final bite before stopping. A third prisoner wiped his hands against his clothing, then adjusted his position on the bench and sat more upright without moving further. One man lifted his cup, drank slowly, then placed it down carefully and rested both hands on the table in front of him. Another prisoner gathered the remaining items on his tray closer together, sliding them toward the center before stopping his movement. A man near the center stood up after finishing, pushing himself away from the table, then stepping back to create space for others. One prisoner beside him followed, rising from his seat and adjusting his stance before standing still near the table. Another man remained seated but no longer eating, lowering his hands and keeping his gaze directed toward the empty tray in front of him. A third prisoner shifted his feet under the table, then adjusted his position again before becoming still. One man near the back stepped away from the table, taking a few slow steps toward the open space before stopping and turning slightly. Another prisoner lifted his tray, repositioned it, then set it down again and remained standing without further movement. A man at the edge of the room leaned back slightly, then straightened and remained still as the activity around him decreased. One prisoner turned his head toward the guards once more, holding the look briefly before returning his gaze forward. The room transitioned from continuous movement into a quieter state, with small adjustments replacing the earlier rhythm of repeated actions. And as more prisoners finished and either stood or remained seated without moving, the final shift took place because the moment that had begun with hesitation had ended in a new pattern that no longer needed to be questioned. They had expected the food to confirm what they already believed about captivity, small portions, controlled access, and a system that limited every action. But the moment the trays were placed in front of them and nothing prevented them from reaching forward, the situation began to change in a way they had not prepared for, because the hesitation that held them in place at the beginning did not come from the food itself, but from what they expected would happen after taking the first step. As the first bite was taken and no consequence followed, the moment repeated itself across the room, turning a single action into a sequence that spread from one man to another until the movement became consistent and no longer required observation before action, replacing the earlier stillness with a steady rhythm that continued without interruption. And as the meal came to an end and the room settled into a slower pace, the change remained visible through their movement alone, because what they had expected to be controlled had not been, and the absence of restriction had already reshaped the way they responded to the moment in front of them. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.